Why does evangelism seem not to be working here in the West? See a lot of people using classical arguments for apologetics, reasoning from their faith, trying to convince atheists and agnostics. And typically when I watch on YouTube, they're just dunking on these fools and humiliating them publicly and saying, this is the answer. Look, it's so clear. But then I don't see people actually coming to faith. I just see these giant I win moments online. What's the disconnect from our gospel message and what's happening in people receiving that gospel message in culture? Why is evangelism broken in the West? Well, I think Augustine has got some answers for us from church history that will apply to our cultural moment. My name is Joshua Lewis. In this episode of Remnant Radio, that's what we're talking about. You stay tuned. Hey everybody, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Remnant Radio. If you aren't already a subscriber, hit that subscribe button, like the video, share it around to those who may be impacted. Today we're talking about apologetics, evangelism, big fancy words. Apologetics just giving a reason and a defense for your faith, but we're doing it from a historical perspective, gleaning on insights from an old church father, Augustine or Augustine, depending on how you want to put that emphasis on that syllable. Thank you so much for tuning into the program. We've got a great episode for you. I've got two PhD scholars with me today. Josh, I should have asked you at the top of the show how I pronounce your last name. I can't even pronounce it. Chatraw?
Yeah. It's Chatraw.
Oh,
it's
not even close.
That's okay.
I'm gonna stick with Josh for the rest of the program. And I've got Mark D. Allen with us as well. Both scholars in their own right. No, they're just actual scholars, not just like honorary scholars. Guys, thank you so much for coming on the program today. Could you maybe tell us a little about your book that you've written, why you've written it, that kind of thing? Whichever first. Josh, we'll start with you. You're on the left. Why not?
Okay, thanks. Hopefully this goes smoother than the start here. So years ago, Mark and I tag teamed for another book called Apologetics at the Cross. And that was a textbook when we were both teaching at the same institution. And one of the things we did in that book is we were really trying to write an apologetics textbook for pastors and missionaries and people going into ministry. Which might seem like an obvious thing to say is we're writing an apologetic book for people in ministry, but that's a whole nother story because they don't always come out that way. Sometimes they can be rather impractical. So we were writing this book trying to be practical. But the first few chapters, we wanted to offer a kind of, hey, how has this thing called apologetics been done through the history of the church? And we were doing this 40,000 foot flyby. And we got to Augustine, this really pivotal figure in church history, probably the most important theologian in the Western tradition. And we had paragraphs to summarize it. And we realized, oh goodness, we are only scratching the surface. And the odd thing about it is a lot of people who are in apologetic leadership today aren't really doing a lot of thinking and interacting with Augustine. Theologians were, people doing political theology were, but not so much with apologetics. And we saw a real kind of opportunity then, but we didn't have time to pursue it. And so we bracketed it out, but we came back to it a few years later and did a pretty kind of, 2 or 3 year kind of study and said, oh goodness, we think there's a lot here that could serve the church. So that's why we wrote the book and a little bit about the background of how we got here.
Yeah, Mark, I guess same question. Do you have anything that you would want to add to that?
Well, I think one of the things I would add is that Augustine was a pastor. He was doing apologetics on the ground, and he had a certain context in which he was ministering during the fall of Rome, in which Christianity obviously had ascended to some real influence and power in the Roman Empire. And here, Augustine lived in a time, and here we live in a time in which some would say is sort of post-Christendom. So there were some links between the challenges that Augustine faced. For example, Christianity was being blamed for the fall of Rome. And we've seen a kind of a change in cultural posture toward Christianity, where Christianity has begun to be blamed for a lot of the ills of society. And the question has been raised is not only is some would challenge Christianity not true, but it's not good. And so here, Augustine is a pastor, and he's doing apologetics with everyday people in the real context of the church. And so we discovered in him a person that we could lean into and glean a lot that might help us in this sort of post-Christian world that we're living in.
Well, but before we dive even further into the conversation today, now that we've kind of framed the discussion of what we're going to be talking about, can you guys take a moment and tell us a little about yourself, your ministry, where you guys are teaching, that kind of thing? We'll start with Josh as well, just so that you guys know
Yeah.
which way we're going.
Thanks. Yeah, so I teach in Birmingham, Alabama. I teach at Beeson Divinity School, which is on the campus of Stanford University. I teach people going into ministry. So we're, as a divinity school, primarily most of our people are going to be missionaries and pastors. And I teach evangelism and apologetic courses to train really the next generation of pastors and theologians. Before this, I served for 5 years as the director for the Center for Public Christianity. So I was, that was in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I kind of had one foot in the academy and one foot on the ground doing ministry in the city to young adults and young professionals. And so did that for 5 years. Before that, I was a colleague with Mark at Liberty University.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mark, same question.
Yeah, I've unbelievably to me, I've been to Liberty University since 2013, so it will be my 12th year. This summer, teach Bible and theology, primarily at the undergrad level and also at the PhD level. I also pastor a church in Appomattox, Virginia, which is about 25 minutes from the university. And I'm also interested, as I mentioned a moment ago, about Augustine's pastoral ministry. So I'm working on a book for Baker Academic called The Whole Life Pastor, and it's Augustinian reflections on pastoral ministry. And so it's kind of cool to be in the pastoral ministry, doing scholarship and research and trying to translate Augustine's pastoral ministry, his pastoral theology, to the real world, the street level ministry.
Mark, let me ask you a question about that, because you mentioned a moment ago how there was a cultural moment that Augustine was in, and you have him engaging with people who are blaming the church for certain events that are taking place in Rome. In the same, I feel, as today, that's taking place. In your book, you guys write that all apologetics are cultural apologetics. Can you maybe explain what that means and how we kind of need to, is it borrowing a phrase from, I guess, evangelicalism at large? Yeah, exegete the culture as much as we are exegeting the scripture, trying to figure out what's going on in our moment and how we can bring the gospel to people who we're at.
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind is a lecture I did about, I guess, less than an hour ago on defeaters in the Christian against the Christian faith, or arguments against the Christian faith. And one of the arguments would be that Christianity suppresses our personhood. Christianity oppresses people. It keeps them from having any fun. It keeps them from being fully alive. And so you will recognize this in a term that's called the culture. Right now, it's called expressive individualism. So Christianity is seen as one that holds a person down, when to be a full person, according to our culture, is to live your truth. You be you. Live out your dream. And so the songs that are sung, the movies, often cast the ultimate virtue, and the ultimate truth is to live according to who you are. And so Christianity is seen as a foe. We need to understand the culture. How are people being shaped into believing these things? They feel like inside that these beliefs about living your dream, you being you, are intuitive, and when in fact they've been shaped and formed by their what Charles Taylor would call the social imaginary. And so Augustine helps us. He was very culturally aware of, especially in the city of God. And actually, he had taken his own journey through the culture in Confessions.
Mm-hmm. So I guess my question would then be, and I'll point this one at Josh, it sounds like we can take former generations' engagement with apologetics and then try to apply them in our cultural moment and not be hitting the target very aptly. It's not as if the message changes, but it's who we're ministering to and how we're ministering to them. I think you guys mentioned in your book the Enlightenment and rationalism, and that kind of apologetic reasoning has been taken into our cultural moment and oftentimes misses the mark in that regard. Could you unpack some of that thinking for us?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. And to kind of build off of what Mark was explaining about expressive individualism and this idea of social imaginary, what we're getting at when we say all apologetics is cultural apologetics is we're saying every time we make an argument or every time we're talking to someone, we're not talking to a neutral or abstract person. We're talking to a particular person at a particular time in history, and that's been and in culture. And so that's true whether you're kind of an analytical philosopher in the academy talking to other analytical philosophers, or there's a certain culture there. There's a certain way arguments and a tradition passed on about how arguments are to be made and what's reasonable and what's plausible and kind of the rules for this. And that's the same thing if you're talking to someone on the street corner. And so what happens is if you don't recognize that apologetics is a kind of tied in with contextualization or tied in with a particular culture always, because we're cultural beings, what tends to happen is we can universalize our preferred way or the way we became a Christian or what was helpful for us. But then we're talking to someone or we're teaching apologetics and we teach a very narrow kind of way. This is the way it must be done. Or we kind of borrow from maybe this was the way that arguments were made 100 years ago. And we think, well, these are always the best ways to make an argument. And what we're saying in our book and what Augustine understood is he had to talk to different people in different ways. And so when he's stepping in the first half of, for instance, City of God, he's stepping in to talk to pagans who have been influenced by Virgil and Virgil's poetry and the story about ancient Rome. And so their affections and their desires and how they think are all impacted by these larger cultural moves. And so he sets out to deconstruct or to critique from the inside these ways of thinking which didn't line up to Christianity. So it's not as if he's not using a kind of rationalism. He's not using rationality. He's using rationality. He's using arguments, but he's very akin to how kind of his audience are thinking and the kind of stories and myths they've embraced. And so sometimes kind of like more recent contemporary times, sometimes we want to use arguments and evidences, which is good and important, without a recognition of this larger social imaginary, the term Mark was using, that a lot of times our logic and the way we look at evidence hangs within. And so what we say at the beginning of the book, kind of one more point about this, is there's been a lot of methodology wars in apologetics about certain things. But in the meantime, as these arguments have been happening, the culture has been shifting, and we haven't necessarily always paid attention to the kind of assumptions and the social imaginary and why culture is shifting and then how to persuade within that. And so really the argument in the book is that Augustine can help us think about the kind of and develop a stronger apologetic that's very culturally aware.
If you're watching this episode, it means that you love the gospel, you love the core tenets of the Christian faith, and you want to share it with other people. That's why you'd be watching a video on apologetics and evangelism. But many of us have a hard time articulating exactly what that faith is. That's why we put a course together for you, an introduction to Christian theology that goes through theology proper, the Trinity, who is the Father, who is Jesus, both his divine and human nature. We dive into the work of the Holy Spirit, ecclesiology, that's the church, eschatology, that's end times, all that and much, much more. 40 lectures doing a deep dive through an introduction to Christian theology. So if you're out there and you're interested in starting your theological journey, understanding the Christian faith so that you can go share it with others around you, I'd encourage you to check out that course today. Could you give me an exact example for how, if I'm taking, maybe a Ray Comfort, I don't know, maybe you're like, hey, this is a great one, but the Ray Comfort style of evangelism that says, have you ever stolen? Well, then you're a thief. Have you ever looked at a woman lustfully? Well, then you're an adulterer, right? We're using what would seem to be a very, again, rational, breaking the law, worthy of judgment kind of thing. That's a model, but does that appropriately minister to the people in this cultural context? And what would be a more appropriate way? I suppose I'm asking in terms of how do we get to the brass tacks of this for people who are listening going, okay, that makes sense. The way I present the gospel is going to be more reasonable to a person if I'm arguing from their worldview or trying to connect it with them where they're at, opposed to former generations' way of receiving that gospel?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I thought you were aiming at me. So coming back at me. So Mark, I'm sure you'll want to fill in some things I say, but I'll have an initial response, and then Mark, you can come in if I leave something out here. I think one way to look at that is there might be some context where that still proves helpful. So that's the first thing to say. What this kind of here's the law, you've fallen short. There's certainly that you see that as a way to describe sin in the Bible. So it's not that we're saying that's unbiblical, but there's another way to describe sin in the Bible, and that's idolatry. And not only is the Bible full of this critique of idolatry, Augustine, who sees us as primarily as lovers, as worshipers, very much was going after the heart in kind of his context, so critiquing the idols of Rome and the idols of the philosophers. And one of the ways he would do it is he would make an argument that idols in the end don't work. Okay, so if we fast forward this to today, just kind of jumping a lot, but jumping to today, one of the things that's going on today is cultural commentators like one scholar named Philip Reef says we've gone from a culture that once kind of assumed they were born to be saved to now a culture that says they're born to feel better. So our culture is looking for ways to cope, looking for ways to deal with anxiety, they sense there's a problem and look at the culture around us as offering us different ways, the health industry, the kind of, SoulCycle, all these different ways to feel better. And for us, what we're saying is that kind of moment where someone might, if you say, hey, you've broken the law and therefore you're a sinner, they might kind of laugh that off and say, well, everyone's, messed up. Come on, give me a break. But if you can come in and describe sin as your problem is you're devoting yourself to the wrong thing, you feel and you sense that there is a problem. And part of the problem is that you're worshiping the created rather than the creator. That's how Paul puts it in Romans 1. And you feel in all of these different ways the disintegration of doing that. And so part of your problem isn't that you want to be happy. The problem is how you're pursuing it. And you feel something's not right. And so it's actually tapping into this kind of cultural desire to feel better and say, well, actually, Christianity can speak to that, interprets what's going on, and gives you a more capacious story, a bigger story to understand that, and the solution, which is Christ, which is that he has, you are meant to worship God, and you've turned from him. And then that's where we can talk about sin, but we talk about sin as idolatry, and talk about Christ as the way to reconcile yourself to God and to worship as you are meant to worship. And so it's putting this kind of, it's exegeting culture, not in a way to ultimately say, culture, you're bad, 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 but to say, even though, culturally you sense certain things, now let's give a Christian understanding of that, which explains more.
So I hear you saying law-gospel distinction is still present, but it's being delivered in such a way that is Christian hedonism, if you will, because that's the way that law-gospel distinction is penetrating culture right now, and that's an interesting concept. Mark, did you want to pick up where Josh left off?
I think, again, approaching this from a pastoral and very humanizing way, in that process, it's very important, I think, and very humanizing to ask questions and not just make assertions. If we're going to administer the balm of the gospel, the healing power of the gospel, and that was one of the favorite metaphors that Augustine would use related to Christ, as he was a healer. And if we're going to do that, then we've got to ask good questions, genuine questions, honest questions of people about what do they long for, how they've been hurt, who are they, what are they seeking, and asking these questions, then we can apply the gospel to the very place that they are, the people that they are. I read years ago that one of the biggest problems that young doctor interns have is they want to label something too quickly before they ask enough questions. And they want to get control of the disease, but they don't yet understand it very well. And so I think as we are folks who want to administer the gospel of the Lord Jesus and the healing power, then we've got to actually ask people who they are and take an interest in them. And I think then the gospel applies. For example, if you look in John chapter 3 and compare it to John chapter 4. And John chapter 3, Jesus is talking to a very religious leader, astute in his knowledge of Scripture, and he talks to him very differently and challenges him from the Scriptures in a very different way than he does to the woman in the well who's been discarded, who's been used, and who is just thirsty and hungry. And he talks to her about giving her a drink. So we have to understand, I think, Augustine is a great example of this, because as Josh referred to before, in the early chapters of the City of God, he really exposes the culture. And Charles Matthews is a scholar on Augustine at UVA, and he says one thing Augustine never did was misunderstand the culture. He understood it. So if we're going to minister to people the gospel of the Lord Jesus, then I think we need to understand who they are, and we do that by listening and asking questions and caring about who they are. I years ago read The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and I'll never forget a couple of things that Covey said, and that is, we look inside our own heads and think we see the world. And so we think what's going on in our heads is going on in their heads. What's going on in our hearts is going on in their hearts. So we have to ask good questions. He also said, seek first to understand and then be understood. So part of the process of doing good apologetics, cultural apologetics, is asking good questions and humanizing the other person and avoiding gotcha moments, but actually trying to understand them.
No, I think that's super helpful. You guys are reminding me a lot of that book, Reading Scripture Through Western Eyes, or the sequel, Reading Scripture Through Individualist Eyes. And they talked about how they'd gather together with people of different cultures to read the scriptures in their missionary journeys. And I think they were with a group of Middle Eastern folks, and they were talking about the story of Abraham eating with God, and God comes down and eats with them. And as they're sitting there having a meal, Sarah brings all of these, the meat comes in, the curds comes in, and they all go, and he goes, what? He goes, there's no bread. She was supposed to make the bread, and they could all see it. But the reader, like the Western reader, goes, I don't get it. There was a crucial piece of hospitality that they understood in the honor shame culture that we just glossed over when we're reading the text, that she went in to bake bread and it didn't come out with the rest of the meal. So it was just an interesting element to realize, cultures pick up on things in scripture, but what you're saying is the cultural moment that we live in is also similar. So like, what was similar about Augustine's cultural moment and ours? I know you've already touched on a few of them, but you said in the City of God, he unpacks his kind of cultural moment, gives like a blueprint for apologetics, and that seems to match in our cultural moment. Who wants to take a stab at that?
I'll get it going, and then Mark can fill in on a few things. And I think, one of the things that you find with Augustine is that he's actually dealing with a plurality of options, and that's similar to today, but distinct from what comes after Augustine. Okay, in the West, and so in the West you have the emergence of what's commonly known as Christendom. And that's when Christianity, a simplistic way to say that is Christianity gets embedded in Western culture so that it forms a kind of common sense. So, it's kind of like you don't necessarily choose to be a Christian. Everyone's just kind of a Christian. And so it's just seen as the kind of normal thing. Well, that is not the world Augustine grew up in. You see it in Confessions, where he starts off, and Augustine has a Christian mom, Monica, and Patrick, his father, the best we can tell, is a pagan. And so he is dealing with this kind of reality of a home life that's split. And as he grows up, he decides, my Monica and her version of Christianity, he grows up in North Africa, which is kind of the backwoods of the empire. And so you have kind of growing up with these very authoritarian bishops, pastors, lots of rules, and it doesn't prize the kind of intellect that in the kind of version that he would later actually adopt. And so he says, no, I don't want my mom's kind of fairy tale kind of juvenile version of Christianity, and so he opts out of that, and he's really pursuing this kind of Roman glory, this kind of achievement narrative way of life, that he can rise up by being a rhetor. And as he's doing that, though, he still has this, he's dealing in Confessions with his own guilt. He's dealing with kind of how to, intellectually, what's the best option. And he tries on all of these different ancient options. And so a couple things right there is just the fact that, today when we grow up, even people who grow up in a Christian home, most of the time very quickly realizes there's other plausible options out there. And with the internet, with just pluralism in general, actually maybe my kind of version of Christianity I grew up isn't the right one. Maybe Christianity's not right. And you see Augustine doing a kind of parallel thing in his own context, in his own way. It's not the type of thing you will see, say, with the Reformers or later on in medieval theology, because they're in a more of a Christian context. And so just his journey alone gives certain parallels where a lot of times in the history of the church, we don't have those same types of parallels. And of course, already what I've mentioned is from Confession is this achievement narrative, which Augustine has very much metabolized, and he's really looking to make a name for himself. And in that context, you didn't do that by YouTube videos or becoming really good at sports. You became really good at speaking. And so Augustine's journey, he travels. It's kind of like the type of story we Americans love to tell. He's got modest means and he ends up in the seat of power in Milan, and yet he's miserable. And so this achievement narrative that he has embraced isn't working out. And as Augustine's writing Confessions, he's writing as a bishop after his conversion, he wants people to see this. He wants people to see all these options were not only intellectually problematic, they had things that he thought these different options would intellectually satisfy him, and they didn't. And he thought that this kind of way of life, this kind of personal achievement narrative that he had embraced, this personal glory narrative that he had embraced would actually fulfill him, and they didn't. And so he's really in Confessions making both an existential argument about satisfaction and rest in God, and also intellectual arguments combined. And it seems to me in our context today, it's not simply good enough to make, as Mark said, these intellectual kind of arguments. In order to move people, we need to be able to speak to their heart. They're looking for ways to cope, ways to live. And again, both of those things map on, I think, in helpful ways. And we try to do this responsibly in the book. Anytime you go to history and you kind of come back to today, you're wanting to say, hey, there's some things that can help us, while always recognizing that the past is a strange land. and yet we just found some unique kind of analogies in places that we felt like Augustine was helpful. I know I went Confessions there. Mark, I don't know if you have some stuff from City of God in particular that I didn't cover.
Yeah, I don't. I'm not thinking of anything. Right now, but I think what he does. Okay.
Sorry,
City of
I
God,
put you on the spot. Sorry, Mark.
No, I was just I was considering how the depth of insight that you were sharing there. But no, I think what we look at in the City of God is that he goes through and he critiques the culture that he was in, and so there's a framework that he gives that I think we can adopt the framework even though we're in a different context. So he starts out in the first part of the City of God by sort of undermining their worldview or their way of being in the world, their social imaginary, their cultural, the way their cultures is functions, and then the second part of the book of City of God is he tells a better narrative, a better story that makes more sense out of what they've been experiencing. So we can use while we're obviously in a different cultural moment, we can use a similar structure. You go inside of the culture and you critique it. You do it what's called an immanent critique, and show how it can't fulfill the deepest desires. It isn't consistent. And then you should go on the outside and show that how Christianity, in the second part of the City of God, tells a better story, a story of redemption, a story of healing, a story of hope, and not just for individuals, but for culture, and not just for culture, but for ultimately for the world. And so while there are differences between our culture and their culture, Augustine's basic framework in the City of God maps onto our cultural moment. And whether you're talking about, I think we mentioned earlier, expressive individualism, and so this desire to be who you are, this desire to live in continuity with who you are. Well, we can critique that from a very individualistic standpoint, from a very selfish standpoint. We can show how that's detrimental to mental health and well-being. It's detrimental to relationships. But then we can show how within the story, within the redemptive story of Christianity, that we were made for a purpose, to love God and to love others. We were made to worship God. Jesus Christ has come to bring healing and restore us to our most basic, the deepest aspects of personhood and who we are. So you can see how that applies in expressive individualism, how that applies to, we can go inside their structure, the structure of expressive individualism, and critique it. And then we can tell a better story of human personhood and how we are fulfilled in loving God and loving other people.
Now, you guys have both, in some sense, talked a little bit about those, again, methods and assumptions, I think, of taking, hey, I'm going to take these models, I'm going to take these methods, and I'm just going to blanket them on individuals. Mark, I hear you talking a few times now about like hearing that person's story. I think in your second chapter there, if I'm not mistaken, it's the second chapter, you talk about things being rather, how do you say it, anthropologically thin, that the way that we view people as these kind of like logic processors, and we use these classical apologetic arguments to just pummel people into theological submission. Could you maybe articulate what that could look like? Well, maybe first describe to us maybe the dangers of some of those assumptions on the front end, but then also explain to us what like an actual evangelistic interchange could and should look like.
Yeah.
Well, Josh, you can answer that one too.
Yeah, I'll jump in on the first part at least. One of the things we're saying is we always have a functional anthropology in our apologetic or in our evangelism. Now, you might not even know what that terminology means, or for scholars, they obviously do know what that terminology means, but they might not be talking about it. And so one of the things we do in chapter 2 is say, let's get this out on the table, because not everyone's even talking about this. In other words, the kind of discussions, it's always like in apologetics has taken us down certain avenues, and one of them hasn't been kind of this theological anthropology. And we're very interested in, even if it isn't said, what is functionally our view of humans? You know, when we have a discussion, when we're trying to persuade someone, there's something behind that. What kind of being am I talking to? And Augustine says we are rational beings in the sense that even as humans, we can sit here and have this conversation and think together, which in certain ways, of course, is unique from other animals. And so, of course, Augustine affirms that. And he also argues that we as humans have to believe to understand. In other words, we have to trust. Most of what we know is because somebody has told us something is true and we have trusted them. So Augustine argues that's just true for everyday life, but it's so much more true with things of God, that we have to have faith to understand. And rather than kind of rationally climbing up a ladder, and then if we have enough evidence, then we'll believe stuff. He goes, no, at the very beginning, there's this believing that's tied into our rationality. But he also argues that in some ways, even in some ways more fundamental to those, although those are true as well, is that we are, as humans, are beings that will worship. We're desiring beings, and we even think towards certain ends. In other words, we have certain ways we want to live. We have certain visions of the good. We have certain visions of the beautiful, certain things that we want, and then we use our reason to try to get there. And so reasoning is aimed towards something, is what Augustine would be an Augustinian anthropology. And so with that, if you just get in, so practically with that, so there's the kind of theoretical basis, but then practically, when you get in a conversation, if you imagine someone they're basically a kind of, as our friend Jamie Smith has popularized, brains on sticks, then I come to somebody and I think they're just waiting for me to solve the kind of metaphysical issues that are in their mind. And so let me just ask them some questions, show that they're contradicting themselves, and then saying, okay, see, you need God. Now, rationally, let me prove God, and therefore I've got this. But as we know, or for most anyone who actually, spends a lot of time talking to humans, humans are much more complicated beings, right? And so often they are worshiping something, and then their reasoning follows from that. And so to try to get in and ask certain questions, and this is what Mark was getting at earlier, and so the example we have in the book is someone who's adopted, who's a Wiccan, and rather than to try to back them in a corner, to show certain things are incoherent, which I think there's a time to do that and a place to do that, we were using this example of someone's first encounter with a Wiccan to say there's probably a lot of questions to be asked there, like why were they drawn to this? Give me your story. Let me understand more about why these beliefs attracted you to this belief system, or these what was attractive about these beliefs. To try to, number one, just get in a conversation with someone and try to understand what's underneath where they're at, and then try to explore that with them. But when you do that, in some sense, you recognize you're giving up some control. And I think this is an important thing to kind of make note of, because a lot of times in the way we teach apologetics, we teach people to always want to stay in control. And our approach is rather to say, hey, not only is this person a worshiper, and we want to get at what they're worshiping, what they're desiring, and how that's problematic, but we also want to be attentive to the work of the Spirit, and that recognize that our desire to control this argument could actually work against where this needs to go. So being attentive to the Spirit, being attentive to this person and where they're at, and knowing that there's some risks with this approach, but we think the risks are worth it. We don't know where the conversation's going to go, but we think if we're open to that, then we're more likely to get to the deeper issues when this person is humanized and when we're attentive to the Spirit, versus I have my script, I have my favorite rational arguments, and I'm just trying to get there as soon as I can to kind of back them into a corner. Now, if we had more time, I just want to point out a real quick kind of footnote to this. Mark and I like arguments, okay? And we have those arguments, and we think there's appropriate times to use those arguments, and we will use those. But what we're saying is there's something bigger that needs to frame those arguments. There's something, so we are rational beings, we're believing beings, but if we are worshiping beings and desiring beings, then we're offering a way, an approach that frames the arguments in something we believe that's truer to what kind of humans we are and how God has made us.
Yeah, I would if you want to use the resurrection as an example, I've become personally convinced that the best explanation for what happened to Jesus after the crucifixion and burial is that he rose from the dead. I feel there's good reasons to believe that, but you could give all the great rational arguments and reasons for the resurrection of the dead, but if it doesn't connect to maybe a person's sense of angst in life, or a person's loss of meaning in life, or a person's sense of guilt in life, or maybe a fear of death in life. So the cognition opens up and functions properly when the heart is addressed and when the heart issues. I've actually observed this in a little encounter I had on a plane one time. I had a lady, a wonderful lady, sitting beside me, and I noticed how she interacted with the other folks on the plane and the attendant, and I thought, wow, she is so delightful, and we're sitting beside each other. And then she asked me what I did, and I explained that I taught theology and apologetics at Liberty University, and immediately she was angry. And she said to me, "I don't think I should even talk to you." But I really wouldn't have none of that. I wanted to engage her. I wanted to talk, and I just kept re-engaging and asking questions, and but she would give strong arguments against my faith and my beliefs and other aspects maybe of who I was that she assumed that might not be true. But I kept asking questions, and I found out that she was from California, and she had grown up in a Christian home, and her parents would abuse her before she would they would take her to church on Sunday mornings. And so by the time we were concluding our conversation, she had shared with me so many things that were beautiful, and she was a lovely person, and she was very much warmed toward me and the message that I had to share with her. But I would have never gotten to that place if I would have just responded, in a very cognitive way, combative way, confrontive way, argumentative way. I would have never, ever gotten there. And I think she was very much open. In fact, we corresponded after that. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the knowing that, no one, we don't think in a vacuum. Our cognition is deeply connected to our loves, our longings, our hurts, our pains. And so if we're going to effectively argue, or let's say defend the faith and persuade others, then we have to really be aware of the relationship between the affections and the rationality.
There's two stories that come to mind as you guys are both of you talked. I thought about the interview between William Lane Craig and Ben Shapiro, where Ben's asking him some questions, and then William Lane Craig, spouts off some answers, and then Ben Shapiro goes, "Well, I don't care." Right? Like, that was just such a weird moment where it was like he wasn't connecting the gospel to the cares of Ben Shapiro, and it was something that couldn't be received, which I thought was interesting. But then the other thing that you mentioned was like trying to control a conversation, and that caused me to think of guys like Jordan Peterson, who it seems like he is not willfully stating Christian faith, publicly stating it, because he doesn't want to be someone's evangelical trophy. Like, he doesn't want to be a notch on someone's theological belt. And I feel as though many people, we live in a culture where Gmail automatically categorizes my emails by stuff I don't want to read. Like, it puts promotions and it, updates, and then these are things you might actually want to read, because our pardon my crassness here, our BS filter is just so high that when you're getting asked questions over and over, you feel like you're in a sales pitch. Well, questions, not like inquisitive questions, but if you did this, and if you did, and you're trying to corner someone, they can sense it. They feel like a trapped animal. I've never seen someone come to faith from that kind of interchange.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so, I mean, one of the things I do just for fun when I speak, sometimes I say, let's talk about, persuasion. Now, how many of you have ever, in the last few weeks, have actually been persuaded of anything? How many of you, by way of argument, have been persuaded of anything? And I get it, not that I write about persuasion, and so this is what I teach, but I think that sometimes we imagine, everyone else is just going to hear our arguments and then they're just going to say, "Oh, of course." But a lot of times, especially in a culture of what I would call a culture of spin, a culture of marketing, we just feel like we're being sold something all day long. And then here comes the evangelist, here comes the apologist, here comes the Christian selling something else. And so we've been trained to kind of keep our hands on our wallets. And so I think for us, it's like, hey, we need to kind of recognize that in a culture of spin, we don't want to be offering the same kind of product, or at least coming across as the same kind of pitchmen. And I think, with that, of course, beyond just kind of how we're perceived is just the importance of caring for image bearers. And the problem with this is it just doesn't, a lot of times young apologists or young people who get into apologists have gotten into it because they've looked at videos where somebody's being owned, or somebody's being made fun of, and there's a sense of triumphalism and power, and they like that. And yet we're saying very rarely does that actually lead to a kind of conversion, and very rarely does it work on a kind of street level. And instead, yes, arguments are important, but there's a lot of other things going on there where somebody's actually says, no, I'm going to commit my life to Christ and follow him. And so we're trying to get, and so much of our work is trying to get at not simply winning an argument, but actual conversion. And that was what Augustine was about. An argument wasn't good enough for him. He wanted to convert. He wanted the Spirit to work through him, so there was actual conversions. And so there's, if you read all of our works and different things, I mean, there's a clear kind of evangelistic sense to this and a pastoral sense to this, not just a kind of apologetic detached from those things. So I think I get excited about what you're saying there, Josh, because it does kind of get at our approach. And the thing that we haven't talked about today is being a kind of person, the right type of person, the right type of apologist is so important. Not just the right arguments, but the right type of believer, the right type of human. And that has to happen through the formation of that happens in our lives by living out the story of the gospel and being in community, being in the church. And so we see the church as actually the training grounds, not ultimately the academy, not as much as podcasts can be helpful. Sorry, not podcasts.
No. Take shots, my guy. Go for it.
But actually in the church. And this is, again, in Augustine's theology, it's him putting himself in the Christian story. It's him in the life of the church, and that is where apologists are formed. And so rather than seeing kind of apologetics as stuff that happens primarily online, primarily on the debate stage, we want to ground apologetics in the church for everyday people, learning from the wisdom of the past, but being formed in such a way that we can be, like Mark told in his story, a kind of non-anxious presence. And so we're not so much worried about ourselves, but we're worried about loving God and loving that person in front of us, which means, hey, I can handle some shots here and I don't have to fire back. I can be patient. I can be a doctor of the soul. I can figure out how to apply the balm of Christ, the medicine of the gospel here, make arguments to support that kind of work, but ultimately want to get to the gospel, want to get to the good news, want to get to how the medicine of Christ heals our deepest wounds and brings us to the living God. And that is the best way of life. And that's the best way, we think, to engage apologetically.
Yeah. Mark, would you pick up on that thought of like the kinds of apologists we need to be?
I think that's exactly, that was beautiful by Josh. It's exactly where I would have wanted to go, because I think before Augustine could do, the city of God, he took the journey through in Confessions that he shares. And I think that to a great extent, he was very vulnerable, very open with his congregation and showing them that he had gone on a journey, that he had left the faith, that he had had angst, that his heart was pulled this way and that way, and that it wasn't easy, like just turn it on and I'm going to believe, but that he put himself within the church, he put himself in that place, and he just to see if it would if he could find some kind of, and he called it certainty, some kind of assurance of faith, and so he had to go to that journey on his own, and he modeled it for his congregation, and he starts Confessions with a famous statement that our hearts are restless until they find rest in you. And so he's finding rest in God, and he's going on a journey. But even when he's so honest that when he gets to the end of Confessions, he has rested in God. He has found the gospel and Christ his all in all, but yet he's still seeking. He hasn't figured it all out. He doesn't know all the answers. He says that he's still seeking, he's still finding, he's still knocking on the door. And so this kind of disposition of a quiet, confident rest in God, but yet a humble seeking. If we're kind of comfortable in our own skin with our faith, then we can relax with people, and it's disarming for them, and they can then begin to think for themselves and seek for themselves. And I ask my students sometimes I ask them, now, which do you learn more from, a professor who is intimidating and he's constantly showing you where you're wrong and showing where he's right, or a professor who takes a genuine interest in you and who asks good questions and who listens? Which are you going to learn the most from, the most valuable lessons? And, they agree that professor who actually cares about them, that professor who actually wants to hear their thoughts and ideas and their struggles. So, I think that's who Augustine was. He had taken the journey himself. He was being formed, and he was being formed through the gospel and through serving the church.
No, I loved both of your statements there, because I think to Josh's point, we bang that drum of normative means of grace, the need of the local church, the centrality of the church. This is at best supplemental, and sometimes it can form in some sense, but man, those regular rhythms of church, my church would practice. We would recite the creed and prayers of confession and thanksgiving, and we have, as a low church as we are, we have many high church traditions very integrated into our service, weekly communion, those kinds of things. So those kinds of forming and fashioning of the individual. I'd be curious what you guys think about the local church and how you see the local church being the forming agent of the believer as it relates to apologetics. Because there is I think a clear distinction. You really made a good point when you're like, there's the YouTube guys online who are dunking on people who don't have a good answer, and they're humiliated and exposed, and yay, the Christian wins because they have a good argument, and that's just not that compelling. But that is what's forming and fashioning people in the apologetic space. And then oftentimes the church, because they don't want to be that, doesn't do any of the apologetic space, and they just care for the people that are local. And that is the main focus of the church, is to care for the sheep. But something about caring for the sheep is mobilizing them to be salt and light in a godly way. So could you maybe speak to how we could begin to address that? And Josh, I'll toss it over to you first.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. Well, let me set it up with Augustine, and then I'll set it up in two ways, by trying to answer in two ways. One is a story. It's in Confessions, when Augustine is really, like I said, he's desperately trying to find a way of life, a kind of that made rational sense, but also made emotional, existential sense. And he's trying on all these different options. And he's at the same time rising up to be kind of a player in the empire. I mean, kind of somebody. And he goes to the center of power, Milan. And he's still an outsider. He's, again, from the kind of backwoods of the empire, has a funny accent. He shows up still feeling like an outsider, but he goes to hear Ambrose, the famous pastor, not because he was interested in Christianity, Catholic Christianity, but he wanted to hear him speak because he heard he was great. And his arguments, or the way he presented Christianity, he says it made him think that it could be rationally defended. So he says that, but then he also says, in this kind of touching statement, he says, Ambrose was kind to me. And you see, it was like you had this powerful person who was really intelligent, and yet he's taken aback that Ambrose would be kind to him, and so it's these combination of factors, both the kind of, yes, the arguments were there, the presentation of this robust Christianity, but the fact that he was kind to him. Now I've lost your question. I'm sorry. Give me your question again.
That question is just like, how does the church form and fashion Christians to be that salt and light in that apologetic space?
So thank you. So one of the reasons I gave that story is, as I think one of the things you have this community who is actually kind, that we would be kind to people, that we would welcome them in. That Augustine's metaphor is, that's often attributed to him, is that we're a hospital for sinners, and that we would say, hey, this is where the bread is. This is where your wounds, whatever they might be, can be healed by Christ. And with that is going to need, from the pulpit and from different places, hey, this actually does make sense. This is actually a better way to live. We need to be able to speak, and not everyone is called to be on the front line of apologetic ministry in the sense of giving these arguments or in public spaces, but having that to be one part of the church and what the church is doing. Because I think you're right. There's a kind of divide between saying, okay, we're the church, we're going to be kind, we're going to do ministry, we're going to have the means of grace, but we're going to leave the arguments for online. And what we're saying is arguments always happen in a context. And oftentimes the online context isn't I would just say it's not the ideal context, but it's embodied in a church. That would be the ideal context, where we're both caring for our community and saying Christianity is true, and let us tell you why. And so another way I'd put this is that in City of God and in Confessions, Augustine doesn't make really any kind of tight division between, or any division at all, between what we would call kind of the work of evangelism and apologetics, and catechizing or teaching Christians. He does them both together, non-Christians and Christians together. And I think for us today, one of the ways we can do this in our church is sometimes we will speak in our cultural analysis about the culture out there as if somehow the culture doesn't come into the church, as if somehow we're immune from that. But the reality is everyone who lives in Western culture is in some ways being catechized, being taught by it, being formed by it. And so the thing about it is their idols are our idols. Their temptations are our temptations. Their false narratives, whether it's the achievement narrative or whether it's certain political narratives, the things that they're living their lives, the scripts that they're living by, also are in the church and in our own hearts. And so as we're critiquing and learning in our sanctification to throw off our false idols, as Luther said, the Christian life is the life of repentance. But as we're seeing these false narratives and calling them out and keeping each other accountable and learning how to reflect on our own hearts, what's actually happening is a kind of apologetic formation. Because then we're better able to say to our neighbors and our non-believing friends and family, hey, as we talk to them, we can say, I know what you're going through. I know the angst as you share that. I can relate to that. And for me, it's rooted in, worshiping my career or worshiping my family, and trying to control all these things rather than having properly ordered loves and being able to describe that to people, because we've done the work of confessions. We've done the internal work within the community of faith, where we're preaching the gospel to one another as we are confessing the false narratives and idols. And once we do that kind of work in a community, then what you have is sanctification prepares us for evangelism. Sanctification creates certain type of people that are a non-anxious presence, and certain type of speakers who are able to identify kind of the cultural malaise and the specific types of idolatry behind that. And it also means we're not going to be that triumphalistic about it, because we know we're sinners saved by grace, and we're here because we're saved, not because we're smarter, because of God's grace, not because we're smarter, not because we figure this out and they can't, not because we just use reason and they're not able to keep up. No, we're here because God has saved us by his grace. And we know the kind of temptations, and we can relate to those, but we can point them to where the medicine is and how that really changes things and changes lives.
That's good. Mark, would you have anything to add on that?
I think a lot about the gathered congregation as we worship together. And yesterday, as I was preaching, I hadn't planned on saying this, but I live in a parsonage right behind the church. And I said that, if I didn't believe the living Christ was among us, speaking and ministering and moving and shepherding, I wouldn't walk from the parsonage over to the church for worship. I wouldn't even, I wouldn't I wouldn't be interested unless the living Christ was among us. And so I try to bring to the service a great awareness of the presence of Christ. And I say this because of Augustine's theology of the whole Christ, that the church is the head, Christ, the head and the body are together. And so on Sunday morning, the first thing we do is we read a psalm. And we don't read a psalm just because it's what you do or it's rote. It's because our voice and Christ's voice are blended together, and he is interceding on behalf of us. Or when we go through the liturgies that we do, whether it's the Lord's Prayer or the Apostles' Creed, these are forming our loves. These are forming our desires with Christ in the middle of it. Or when I preach the word, I want them to hear the voice of Jesus speaking to their hearts. And when we take Holy Communion together, Christ is there, and we are partaking of his death on our behalf, of his love, and taking it in. So the reality of the living Christ shepherding the congregation as we gather for worship, that's very formative. That's how we become good defenders of the faith, good apologists as the church together. When I was younger, I enjoyed reading, things like whether it was Thomas Merton or Francois Fenelon, Henry Nouwen, Dallas Willard. I loved sort of the spiritual formation and the mystical aspects of our faith. But the older I get, the more I see that's not something that I do by myself. That real presence of Christ is with us in the gathered community, and that we experience this deep and profound presence of God together, that he's here. And with all the gifts being used, as we gather together and sing and worship, we are formed into the image of Christ through his body.
Amen.
Mhm.
Yeah, every joint and ligament supplying the necessary upbuilding. Gentlemen,
Yeah.
this has been a fantastic program. Very encouraged by it. I know it'll be helpful to our audience. What would be places where they could pick up your book? I mean, Amazon, I see it up on here on Scribed. Is there a specific location that you'd want to point them in that direction? All the same?
Yeah.
No. Feel free to get it. I guess wherever you can find
Wherever
it.
you pick
which
up
is my-
books.
Yeah, wherever you pick up books. I will say, because you encouraged us to offer shameless plugs here. I do have a kid's book on Augustine coming out
Cool.
in June. It's just called Augustine of Hippo, how a doubter became a church father. And so I wrote this with my son, and who's 11, and really my whole family kind of pitched in. It's a lot of fun. A hippo tells the story, Augustine of Hippo, and so it's one of those books.
Did I hear you
Josh,
say a hippo tells a story?
The hippo tells the story.
I love it.
And if you I don't know, there's a trend a few years ago, and I think a really great trend with all of these kids' Bible. Storybook Bible and the Big Storybook Bible, and a lot of parents were saying, "Man, I'm reading this to my kids and I'm learning things."
Yeah.
And I'm in a Baptist church, a low church setting, and I mean, a lot of times you'll say I work on stuff with Augustine, and they're, who's that? and maybe some of you listening to are kind of like, I don't know anything about Augustine. Well, this is a place to kind of get in, and you don't have to be embarrassed by that, because you can just read it to your kids while at the same time really learning the story. It's got great pictures. Sorry, I said too much. Mark's got a great book coming up in a different side on Augustine as pastor, as I think you mentioned before, but it's going to be good as well. So,
yeah, that's funny. I was going to say the last thing you said. It is very, very well illustrated. Very well illustrated. It's a delightful book, and so pick it up, learn for yourself, help your kids know a little bit about who Augustine is.
To be clear, when you say well illustrated, you are talking about the kids' book, not your pastor's book. I just want to make sure, because if you got a pastor's book with pictures, the dyslexic guy is definitely going to pick it up.
I doubt that my book will be well illustrated, or you'll want to read it to your kids.
Well, thanks for the heads up.
I'm doing a book, and I've pastored for a number of years, and pastoring is difficult. The complexity of pastoring and our with all the our generation, with all the different cultural currents, and the different things that the congregation's going through, and I try to take some of the pressure off of the pastor, and by approaching the ministry very holistically and integratively, but ultimately by showing that Christ is the one who pastors the church. Christ is the one who shepherds the church, and we're his under shepherd. And hopefully folks can read the book and have a renewed excitement for the ministry and a renewed hope in Christ's work in his church.
Amen. Yeah. Guys, again, thank you so much for coming on the program. I appreciate it. I know it'll be much enjoyed by the listening audience. And for those of you who are out there, hit that subscribe button. Again, like the video if you enjoyed it, and make sure to go pick up that book. We put a link of it in the description below. We'll see you guys next time on Monday or Wednesday from 4 to 5 p.m. Central Standard Time. Peace out.